We're Topple Galloway.
I'm Steve Topple.
And I'm George Galloway. The streets of London were filled, well, not quite filled, tens of thousands of soft shoe shuffles. It was a silent demonstration. The people's vote they demanded, though only on the EU, not on anything less contentious, of course. You could hardly hear them because of the quality of the footwear. I'm fixated on this. It was the most expensively shod demonstration ever seen, but not heard, in London. Steve Topple, you saw it as well as me. It looked to me like a Waitrose outing, a kind of mass Waitrose picnic.
Don't. This damned march. Yeah, I tweeted and it was very contentious. I called them a bunch of middle-class liberals with their gluten-free craft ale and what have you, and vegan pork scratchings. Look, it essentially was. You could see the elements that organised it. You had the Chukara Munners and the Chris Leslies and the usual Green Party suspects.
Tony Robinson, Baldrick was there accusing Corbyn of having betrayed all the young people who voted for him.
And portrayed the turnip eaters in the UK, as Baldrick probably would be very annoyed about. Yes, betraying the youth. And look, I'm not even sure where to begin with this march. The first obvious contentious issue of it, which Owen Jones, or Little Lord Stockport, as some of us call him, Owen tweeted that quite rightly, a second vote on the referendum would surely just divide the country more. We've already seen great chasms of division over the Brexit decision. It's emboldened the far right and the language and the sort of use of bias and unfounded statistics from the likes of Nigel Farage, and surely a second vote would just divide the country even more, no?
Yeah, of course, and perhaps dangerously so. If the Leave vote was again narrowly confirmed, would the soft shoe shufflers accept this? I doubt it. And if we decided narrowly to remain in the European Union, what do you think the huge number of Leave voters would think of that? Would they feel betrayed, cheated, stabbed in the back? Would it facilitate radicalisation on the part of the element of Leavers, right-wing, xenophobic, foreigner-hating, suspicious, conspiracy theorists? I mean, the idea of running this referendum again, and potentially again until you get the vote that our betters want us to achieve, is so fraught that even originally, you mentioned Omona, Omona himself denounced the idea of a second vote. Because at that point they thought the Parliament would wreck the Brexit. That's not now looking likely.
No, exactly. Yes, he was on the record on This Week with Andrew Neil saying, no, we shouldn't have a people's vote on the terms of the referendum. But the thing is, this march just summed up everything that irritates me about the sort of liberal middle classes in this country. They're silent over the course of the past 8 years on lots of issues which I constantly campaign about. They weren't there when I've sat with the disabled people on the streets fighting for their most basic of human rights. And they're in the same sort of thread as the Guardian journalist who's the sister-in-law of Boris Johnson, who came out and broke the story of the Windrush scandal. But where were these people 2 years ago when I was marching with an unknown grassroots group on the ground campaigning about that issue then? These people pick and choose their fights.
Oh, for sure. There's a double narrative running though, isn't there? One is to damage Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
Even though Corbyn, by all academic and systemic analysis, did more for the Remain cause in his meetings around the country than any other.
I have to interject to that point, yes, because there was a study done by the Media Reform Coalition which proved that Corbyn was the most active campaigner on Labour's position on Brexit during the referendum. Alan Johnson, who was supposed to be running the damn campaign, was nowhere to be seen.
So that's one narrative. The Labour right, the Blairites, Campbell, imagine Campbell demanding
The
people's
hypocrisy.
vote. If we'd had a people's vote on the Iraq war, he would have been swept away and there would have been no war. Or Campbell and Blair demanding that the Prime Minister pay attention to a demonstration of some tens of thousands when they ignored a demonstration of some millions and went ahead with their war on Iraq anyway. Yes. But there's a second narrative. It's Russia what done it. It's Putin what done it. He's rigging the World Cup. He rigged the Catalonians. Yes. He rigged the American election. Indeed. He rigged the Brexit.
My toilet isn't flushing. He rigged that too.
So this has multiple narratives running in it. But it is essentially a small liberal, a small L liberal and a big L liberal component. After all, it was the Liberal Democrats who stood on the platform at the general election not a year ago, promising a people's vote. Yes. And they got 7% of the popular vote. They were annihilated in the election. Mm-hmm. Labour stood on a manifesto to accept the result of the referendum, which you could call a people's vote, as did the Conservatives. Mm-hmm. And between them, they got well over 80% of the vote.
Exactly. So surely logic would dictate that, well, we've already had a vote on that because it was in the manifestos and people voted on the content of Labour, Tory, Liberal manifestos and therefore decided accordingly. So there is no mandate either, as you say, for a people's vote.
Interestingly, they were overwhelmingly white. Mm-hmm. They were overwhelmingly middle to upper class. I never saw so much Hermes, so much jewellery to rattle on a yes. demonstration. And they were overwhelmingly the people who have benefited from Britain's long 40-year plus membership of the European Union. Indeed. Their problem is that they are outnumbered massively by those for whom the last 40 years have been a disaster. 40 years ago when we joined the EU, they had a secure job. They were in a trade union organised position. They had free education, free health service. Britain was overwhelmingly a publicly rented community, council housing, with council community centres, swimming pools, ice rinks, all the things we had yes. 40 years ago have been wiped out. And they wonder why the majority of people still say no, no thanks.
So, carrying on the continental theme, George, I believe you were in Malta.
I was, I'm just back actually. I was commemorating the 30-year anniversary of a truly epic event. The HMS Ark Royal, the British gunboat supreme at the time, the giant aircraft carrier, it was proceeding as normal in the Mediterranean and intending to dock in its former fortress of Malta. But they didn't figure on the opposition of the trade unions in Malta to nuclear weapons. And as the Ark Royal was a nuclear weapon capable vessel, the Labour opposition, it was a different Labour in those days, demanded that according to Malta's constitution, which enshrines neutrality and peace, that it would be a breach of the constitution to allow this warship in. Now, you've got to know that the British owned Malta until just a few years before, 1972, in fact. And so the Labour opposition called on the unions to blockade the port. And on that day, 30 years ago, blacksmiths became admirals, shipwrights and labourers and deckhands became naval officers. They commandeered a rust bucket called the Copper Mountain and tugged it, totally illegally, into the harbour and blocked the entrance to the harbour. Okay. And these admirals of the British fleet were apoplectic and demanding that the Maltese government roll over and cry, Uncle John Bull, but they refused. And the workers tugged another boat, actually, a second boat, and the Royal Navy was turned away. And this is an example of a Labour party which acts in concert with the labour movement, which is kind of what it says on the tin, or used to. It was an example of a newly independent country that meant what it said when it asserted its popular sovereignty. And of course, this was all the fruit of the premiership and leadership of a man called Dom Mintoff. Hardly anyone remembers him now of your age, but he was a huge figure in the 1970s, and considering his country had the total population of a medium-sized city in England, this was a remarkable thing. He was the first European leader to recognize Red China. He went to China, he concluded a deal with them, they built the Red China dock, for which these dockers then worked. Of course, now thanks to the European Union competition rules, what was once 1,000 dockers is now 100, and the Red China dock is now some commercial entity because they won the tender. But it was an example too of Mintoff's anti-imperialism, which was really vibrant. For example, when he did lease to the British Royal Navy the use of some small part of the docks, he stipulated in a copper-bottomed guarantee that no attack on any Arab country would be permitted from Malta. And yet, just a couple of years ago, Malta was the base for the destruction of Libya, which is just 200 miles away. So it was like, although it's only 30 years ago, it was like a trip down memory lane for me, because I lived in that era. Real labour, real unions, a real peace movement, and a real anti-imperialist camp.
I was going to say, the two sort of standout points from your story for me are firstly the notion of Labour acting illegally and daring to do some direct action. And also the idea of this small sovereign country, if you like, defying imperialism. What lessons do you think, firstly, the Labour movement of today can learn from that? And also, do you think we'd see that sort of action?
I do. You see, for Mintoff, read Corbyn. For the General Workers' Union of Malta, read Sam McCluskey and Unite. I could easily see a Prime Minister, Corbyn, take a stand for British sovereignty and independence against the domination of bigger powers, and calling on the labour movement, the workers, without whose efforts, of course, nothing can move. Neither the Ark Royal nor the Copper Mountain could move without the workers. So I really could see it, but I'll tell you how things have changed in Malta. The Prime Minister of Malta is Tony Blair's new best friend. Blair is a regular visitor now to Malta. The leader now, Prime Minister now, with a record majority in Malta of 7, again, a bit like Blair. He's only 44, but he's announced his imminent retirement. Now, either he's going to go off and make a pile of money like his hero, or maybe they have some political plans for him. Now, what the word on the street was, not from the political people, but from the workers on the street, was that they suspect that the current Maltese president, whose name is Muscat, Joe Muscat, is going to sell Malta's neutrality. It's going to sell Malta back to the big military powers by dropping the neutrality clause and by excising the word striving for peace from the constitution, make Malta just another country, and moreover not another country at all, just somebody else's foreign military base. But if they try to do that, the presence of Mintoff on the island, though he's now long dead, is very, very powerful and strong. He's the Che Guevara of Malta. His influence is still there, especially amongst the working people. So Malta's now Europe's gambling capital. I don't know if you knew that.
It is.
They sell passports for $1 million each.
I knew that as well, yes.
And they have attracted every gambling and gaming country in the world to locate in Malta. But I warn the Prime Minister of Malta, from my brief taking of the temperature, taking on Dom Mintoff's legacy is a very high-risk game of chance. Not since the Victorian era, when travelling freak shows would tour Britain with boneless wonders and bearded ladies and two-headed men, to an aghast population looking at the grotesque and the wonderfully ugly, has anything in Britain been seen like the royal curtsy of our Prime Minister, Theresa May? Speaking of boneless wonder, it was, for me, like watching a cartoon skeleton fold up. The one thing that it made everybody in Britain do was cringe. Steve Topple, the royal cringe. How was it for you?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was something straight out of the Monty Python sketchbook, wasn't it, really? Oh, look, I mean, did we expect anything less from her, aside from her personal aesthetic attributes, which are questionable at the best of times? It's just this snivelling, subservient, forelock tugging from the Conservative Party that we come to expect. But then again, it's no different. You could almost hear Prince William thinking, well, Tony Blair went lower than that.
Can't have, surely. It must be the lowest that any Prime Minister has gone.
It was horrific, but it plays into a sort of bigger narrative at the minute, doesn't it, really?
What was the, what was Cromwell all about? What was the English Revolution all about? Why cut off a king's head only to collapse like a cheap tent in the wind?
Exactly.
When you're confronted not even by the monarch, and not even by the heir to the monarchy, but by the heir to the heir of the monarchy. She humiliated us with that curtsy.
No, absolutely, and this whole notion of royalty as well, that somehow they're appointed by God, and whatever your beliefs in religion, I think most religious people could probably agree that the royals are not appointed by the Lord above.
I would have hoped that if the God had anointed a head of state, it would have been rather more impressive than the lower middle class family that rules over us and once ruled the waves. Speaking of that, Steve, you'll have noticed that Prince William, the said Prince William, is in Jerusalem, and he's staying in the King David Hotel. Not a lot of people know, and our media are not doing their best not to remind them, that the King David Hotel used to be the British headquarters in Mandate, Palestine, which was blown to smithereens in a terrorist bomb attack, killing almost 100 people on the 22nd of July 1946. And I've read all the reports of Prince William's wonderful $4,400 a night suite there, and not one of them has mentioned that the blood and the bones of British civil servants, British soldiers, policemen, visitors to the hotel in 46 lie in the ash of that terrorist bomb attack.
No, absolutely. And the whole situation is rather bizarre as well, looking at it, because on the one hand, if you juxtapose it with Theresa May grovelling at Prince William's feet, if you like, then of course the basis for this visit to Israel from Prince William is that he's doing it at the request of the UK government. It's a very strange situation.
First time ever, by the way. No British royal has gone there in 70 years.
No, indeed.
Because the royals at least know. This is kind of iffy. Jerusalem is illegally occupied territory.
It's a very important point, because he put the cat amongst the pigeons already, or rather Kensington Palace did, didn't they? Because Prince William in his official statement said that he is visiting occupied Palestinian territories.
Good for him,
of course, and the Israeli government kicked off.
It's more than Theresa May says.
No, exactly.
Even though she knows it to be true.
Of course she does. I mean, the basis for that is nonsense. I think it was 1980, wasn't it, that Israel passed a law declaring Jerusalem a complete sort of
undivided capital.
That's totally illegally.
Absolutely illegally. In 1967, they seized it by force. The inadmissibility of acquiring territory by force is a matter of international law. You may not make permanent changes to a territory illegally acquired by force. Yet all of that is being ignored, certainly in the British media, if not by Prince William himself. Fair play to him. It was good that he said that. But of course, on this trip to Israel, he's being given the full 9 yards of the propaganda tour. He will not meet Mordechai Vanunu under house arrest in Jerusalem, because Vanunu was the man who blew the whistle on the hundreds of illegally acquired nuclear weapons that Israel has. He will not, it would appear, be allowed even to visit the graves of the, I think, 800 British personnel who were murdered by Israeli terrorism during the Mandate period. Including sergeants hanged by piano wire in the orange groves. He's even staying. I mean, isn't that a bit adding insult to injury? You're putting the British royals up in the hotel that the British state used to own.
There's something very strange.
Blew up and killed a lot of Britishers there. There's not even a plaque to them. There's nowhere he can lay flowers at. So Israel obviously intends to use this to make William curtsy to them in the way that Theresa May curtsied to him. It's pretty circular and pretty grim.
And pretty perverse.
Yeah, it's a perverse world we're living in.
So, the debate about the decriminalisation of cannabis has been put into sharp focus again in the past week or so, with the Home Office allowing 12-year-old Billy Caldwell, who suffers from severe epilepsy, to be allowed medical cannabis. George, now, whether we slightly differ on this or not, I'm not quite sure. My position is very much for decriminalisation of cannabis.
Only cannabis?
Yeah, that's more of a tricky question for me. I think the decriminalisation of drugs generally, I think, needs to be looked at. Cannabis for me is a definite, purely, firstly for medicinal purposes, and secondly because it is a completely natural product, which has been shown to cause very little harm. However, let's deal with the medical side of it first. So we have a 12-year-old boy who doctors abroad in the Netherlands have said that cannabis oil in its current form is extremely good for treating this child, for reducing him from over 100 epileptic seizures a day to very few epileptic seizures a day. The mother tried to bring cannabis oil into this country. She was stopped at customs and it was taken off her after lots of coverage from the media. Home Office agreed to let her have this oil back, and it's now obviously opened a huge debate because there are other children, high-profile cases over here where they have been treated with cannabis oil and it's now been denied. You've had that well-known liberal, libertarian anarchist, William Hague, piping up, saying that cannabis should be decriminalised.
You lost me. Anything supported by William Hague is unlikely
it's
to
a bit of a conundrum.
Yeah.
But honestly, so what's your position on this? Mine is quite clear, but...
well, of course, I don't want to see any children suffering. If it can be medically attested that medicinal use of cannabis oil in these cases should be permitted, then of course I would never stand in the way of that. But what is already clear, and if I may say so, even in your opening discourse, is that this will be used to widen the debate about decriminalisation as a whole. Now, I was born and therefore am of an age where cannabis has never been in my life. I might shock you if I tell you, I don't even know what cannabis looks like. Is it oil? Is it a leaf? Is it resin? I don't know. I've never seen it. I've never seen any drug or ever taken it. But then, as I don't even drink alcohol, I'm not your typical Britisher. And of course I know that there are many people, some say millions, regularly taking cannabis and therefore breaking the law, making the law an ass, it's fairly clear that if there was a people's vote, to coin a phrase, on the matter, cannabis probably would be decriminalised. But what then? First of all, cannabis is not an entirely natural product. Maybe the product in the 60s was, maybe the product that this child will be given is. But skunk, which is super enhanced cannabis, has been shown to have an intimate connection with mental illness, sometimes many years after the heavy use of skunk was taken. So which cannabis are we talking about? Which would be legalized or decriminalized and which would not? That's an important issue. And then there is the issue of the gateway argument, that once you start stupefying yourself with one product, aren't you more of a sucker for, you know, you'll get even higher on this product? Why don't you go through this gate? And where do you end up? Now, of course, I know that the so-called war on drugs is failing. My argument is there isn't really a war on drugs. I came through the airport last night. Nobody checked my bag. Nobody has ever checked my bag. I was coming from Malta, where there's been known to be a bit of trading. Nobody from the flight was checked. So I don't actually believe there is a war on drugs, but I know that we're spending billions on a pretend war on drugs and it isn't making any difference. So you need to persuade me that fewer people will intoxicate themselves if we decriminalize it than are already intoxicating themselves. For I am against the intoxication of the masses.
Okay, so my argument is kind of a bit deeper than most people's, if you like, with regards to when it comes to drug use, and particularly as well when it comes to alcohol use, because one thing that I find extremely bizarre in this country is that alcohol is perfectly illegal, and yet when you look
you get sent to the House of Lords if you sell enough of it.
Exactly, yes. I've seen so many debates at 2 a.m. in the morning in the House of Parliament where they rock back from the Strangers Bar for a vote. Yeah. Absolutely
quite clearly all drugged.
Yep. Whereas that's fine. However, there's a deeper argument for me. I do hear your points about cannabis and the fact that it's now laced with so much stuff. That, in some respects, is an argument for decriminalisation, because you have gangs now watering it down and enhancing the product so much that it's causing harm. Whereas if it was decriminalised and people could grow it themselves for their own personal use,
is that what would happen, or would it go to monopoly? I mean, would WD and H.O. Wills reopen their cigarette factories, making
now this is the challenge, because of course once it would be decriminalised, then it would be corporatised as well, as we well know. But there's a deeper issue here, and it's far too complex, in my opinion, for this programme. But my school of thought on specifically addiction and drug misuse and alcohol misuse is that there's something deeper going on. I adhere to the work of a psychologist called Dr. Galloway, who believes that any form of addiction, whether it be alcohol or drugs or sex or anything we use to negate the anxiety that we have about things, the root of all that is capitalism, ultimately. That capitalism is turning us into a very sick society where people are so horrified by what it's doing to the world and the way it severs our connections from each other and from our environment, that people are turning to drugs or some sort of release in whatever form to get away from the horrors of capitalism and what it's
But we'll never get away from capitalism if the masses, instead of organising for a new society, are lying on their sofa stupefied with drugs.
Well, no, this isn't.
That's already happened with previously politicised communities in Britain. For example, in the 1970s, if you went down Brixton, you would find it bristling with political activity and radicalism. But it isn't now. And I blame cannabis for that.
Well, I blame capitalism for that, but I do hear your point. However, if you look at what's going on around the world, for example, in Portugal, they use what's called heroin heroin rooms in Portugal where people can safely inject the drug. They're not saying that they're not opening it up to everyone can use heroin whenever they want, but there are specialist heroin rooms where people can safely inject using clean needles and then slowly come off their dependency on the drug.
But do they come off it?
They do. The rates have completely bottomed out in Portugal with regards to the use of heroin. It appears to have worked. The contrary point to that, to play devil's advocates for a second, is in Canada, where they've legalised cannabis but also reduced the laws around heroin as well. What's happened over there is people have switched from heroin to prescription drugs now, and the rates of addiction to prescription drugs have rocketed.
Well, let me take you down a canyon of horror in the beautiful city of Vancouver, one of the world's most beautiful places. I took a walk, not intending for it to be on the wild side, just past the central train station, on the seafront, when you would have thought miles of tourist traps lay ahead. Instead, I came upon a street which was the land of the living dead. There were literally hundreds, if not a small number of thousands, in one street, walking around, falling down in front of my eyes. It was the opioid capital of North America, where people are being given fentanyl and these other heroin substitutes. In Britain it's called spice and all kinds of ugly names like that. And the people were literally collapsing in front of my eyes. At first I was afraid, but then I realized none of these people were in a state to cause me any harm. They were in what I thought was a film set at first. This is in Vancouver. This is the product of legalizing the use of these narcotics. That's probably not the right phrase, narcotics, but I'm not really in this field. But these people were taking fentanyl and other substitutes freely, legally, openly. I tell you, if you took a walk down that street, you might be less sanguine about decriminalisation in Britain.
Possibly, and like I say, I hear your point. My argument, and I maintain this argument, that the decriminalisation of drugs will not be enough, because at the root of the problem is capitalism itself. Until we solve that problem, we are never going to solve the problem of drugs and alcohol abuse.
One of the things that needs to be taken on board is that it will be very difficult to get Parliament to vote to legalise cannabis. Same as it won't vote to legalise euthanasia.
Yes.
Because then you would have concentrated campaigning by people who were against, bringing so much pressure to bear on the parliamentarians. They're unlikely to have the courage of their convictions, even if their convictions are moving in your direction. Yes. So what you have, just like on euthanasia, is other people change the law in practice, without it actually being passed as a law. In the case of euthanasia, it's doctors. In the case of drugs, it's the police.
Yes, Durham Police Force very prominently came out and said that we're not
no longer tackling cannabis as a crime.
Yes.
Well, that's all we've got time for. We've been Topple Galloway.
And we look forward to joining you next week. Please remember, if you have any topics that you'd like us to raise, or any questions, any suggestions, any comments about, I don't know, George, our hats maybe, or our hair.
There's a lot of comments about that.
Get in touch on Twitter, either at George Galloway or at Mr. Topple. Until next week, take care of yourselves. Just one more thing on the People's Vote March. Look, I caused a lot of controversy on Twitter by calling these people middle-class liberal nitwits who are more concerned with their gluten-free craft ale and vegan pork scratchings. However, there's a few bigger issues at play here. Firstly, they're ignoring the fact that the challenge we always had with the referendum was we were stuck between a rock and a hard place. We were stuck between the corporatist, capitalist EU, which would sell workers out, not even giving it a second thought, or we were stuck between more of the same corporatist savageness from the Conservative government. And we've ended up getting the Conservative government option. Things are not going to get better if we have a people's vote on the Brexit deal. It's going to encourage more division, more sectarianism. What we should be doing is getting out onto the streets and campaigning against the Conservatives and trying to win over hearts and minds with our arguments, not creating more division.
Just one more thing. Prince William, the heir to the heir of the throne, should not be making an official state visit to Israel. But he's done the country and indeed the world proud by continuing to insist on the legal truth that the old city of Jerusalem, that the eastern part of Jerusalem, the holy city itself, is illegally occupied Palestinian territory. He may have made them shift uneasily in the British Foreign Office. He may have made them shift even more uneasily in the illegal occupation government in Jerusalem. But he did the right thing. And I, for one, can say, all hail Prince William of Windsor.